Thousands of years ago, the first stories were told. And though it is thousands of years from the first time someone opened their mouth to tell a story, we have taken very few steps away from that original oral tradition of storytelling. And I think that looking back at oral storytelling can actually teach us a lot about writing. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. We live in the present, and most people, or at least it seems like most people, forget that thousands of years of history have brought us to this point. And even if you're more engaged with history, it is probably the case that you go through most of your daily life not thinking about it. But history is very important, and I've talked about why history is so important in the past. I think history is important because it teaches us so much. We've seen how people have acted in the past, and we've seen the results of those actions. And then we can take the results of those actions and we can frame our lives and frame our societies, and we can move forward in a better way. We can actually make the world better if we can understand history, and then we can draw correct conclusions from history. Certain things in history can inform what we are currently dealing with. And by looking back at history and having a clear understanding of history, we can actually build these things around us into something even greater. And I'm not talking about politics. Some examples I'd give are the best types of clothes to wear in winter, how to put together a more efficient engine, or even which architectural design is the best for bridges. In the present day, there are multiple different ways to tell stories. There's movies, there's video games, there's books, there's even different types of storytelling in each of these different things. Some video games are very open-ended. Some are very linear. Some books are choose-your-own-adventure. Some movies have become choose-your-own-adventure as well. But the first stories were told from one person to another. It was one person talking to another. And for a very long time, the oral tradition, one person talking to another, was the way in which people conveyed stories. Now, throughout history, we developed those other ways of telling stories, but it all goes back to oral storytelling. So why would oral storytelling matter today? Why would telling a story with your mouth, with your gums flapping, actually matter today? If you're writing a book, you're actually still within the oral storytelling tradition. What do oral storytellers do? They use language to convey ideas. They not only use the meaning of the words they are using, but they actually use the cadence. They use the form of the language as well to convey what the story is. They use the sounds, they use the grammatical structure, they use the pauses, the flow, etc. Doesn't that sound a bit like writing? Doesn't that seem that we are doing the exact same thing with writing? So if it is the case that we are actually trying to do something very similar, if not the same thing, as those oral storytellers, but we are doing it in a written form, should we not look back and see if there's anything that this very basic form of storytelling can teach us? Can it inform our writing to help us be better writers in some way? I think it actually does for one major reason. If we don't think of ourselves just as writers, but we think of ourselves as people who are trying to use words as they're supposed to be said to create a beautiful story or to create a beautiful tapestry of words that will be conveyed to a person and will bring pleasure to that person because of how the words are put together, I think we are going to view our writing differently. I think we are going to approach writing differently. The very fact that we don't just view ourselves as writers, but we view ourselves as someone who is putting down words that are actually meant to be spoken whether inside a person's head or on a person's lips. I think if we view ourselves in that way, we will actually shift how we look at our writing itself, because we aren't just trying to make words sound good on paper. We're not just trying to make the words sound good in our heads. We actually need to make those words sound good if they were spoken aloud. And if we have this idea that we're trying to go back to the oral tradition, I think it roots us back in the language even further. Because if you're writing, I think you can get disconnected from how language works on a day-to-day basis. I think you can get lost in the weeds of the grammar that people have pulled from language. I think you can get lost in the weeds of the rules that people have set up. And I think that if you start to think of storytelling, even if it's written in a book as an oral story, you'll actually start to look at the people around you. You'll actually start to look more at how people actually talk. And by seeing how people actually talk, by studying how people actually talk, and trying to bring how people talk into your writing, I think it's going to be the case that you're going to have better writing. Because I think that talking is such a natural thing to people that when they talk to another person, when they converse, or when they're trying to tell another person something, they don't think about it. They just explain themselves in the rawest form possible. And though I don't think you should try to mimic that raw form completely in your writing, because I think writing has diverted itself slightly from this oral tradition in some ways, I think that raw form of communication, I think that raw form of people talking to one another conveys things in a way that is deeper, if I can say it that way. I think it conveys things, one person to another, in a way that is more human. And I always go back to this idea of our writing trying to get to the heart of what it is to be human. And if it is the case that at the heart of what it means to be human is this conversation we have with one another, we should definitely understand how that communication works. We should definitely understand how talking works between one person and another. It is actually the case that writing is not something instinctual to a human being. Writing is something we learn. So it is the case you need to practice it, but writing is based on something instinctual. We do not teach babies how to speak. And even people who have a very low intelligent level can speak as well. So what is something practical we can do based off this idea that our writing is connecting back to that oral tradition? Our writing is connected back to speaking itself. I think there's something really simple. Reading what you write aloud. I think this helps so much because when you're writing something down, you don't get the effect of how it actually sounds when it's spoken. And when you speak it, you're actually going to be hearing it in the worst way it possibly can be heard. So if it sounds good when you say it, it almost certainly sounds good when you read it. Another reason I think it's very important to read things aloud is that you can see whether the person who's reading it is going to be able to connect to it in a way that actually makes sense to them. Sometimes we get so lost in our own thoughts, we get so lost in the way we think that we actually skip over things, we omit things, we add things that actually aren't there, if that makes sense. What we are doing is we have this whole set of ideas that we're working with, and sometimes when we are reading silently, we actually add those extra pieces of information from our mind into what we're reading. And what it does when we read something aloud is we actually have to activate more parts of our brain. We actually have to be more engaged in those words. And what it does is it actually puts something out into the world, and it's easier for us to catch those issues with our writing. So again, it actually shows us what something sounds like when it is spoken, and then it helps us strip away the extra pieces that we're adding to our writing when we're reading it by ourselves. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.